So good morning again. My name is Josh. I get to serve as pastor here. And for all of you who would consider yourselves more of an introvert, thank you for kind of going outside of your comfort zone this morning and saying hi. I say this often, but I say it often because I mean it. Church is so much more than a song we sing or a sermon that is spoken. Church is about being a part of the body of Christ. And people find this hard to believe about me, but I'm actually introverted. Oh, yeah. Yep. No, I'm a functional extrovert, right? So I've learned how to deal with, no offense to any of you, interactions in the world. But I don't often get filled up being with people. I get filled up being alone. That's how I would describe an introvert, somebody who needs to be alone to get filled up, and that's me. And some people will occasionally ask my wife, like, how do you deal with him? And they mean that in many wonderful ways, I'm sure. But one of them has to do with, how seemingly outgoing and relational I am. And she's like, you only get to see a portion of the Josh. So for those of you who find it harder to have those kinds of semi-awkward conversations on a Sunday morning, thank you for leaning in. Maybe we'll all grow in that connectedness with each other as part of the body of Christ. All right. I want to start our time together with a group challenge this morning, okay? Group challenge. If you have a piece of paper and a pencil, you're going to need it, or if you can pull out your phones without getting distracted, go ahead and do that as well. What I'm going to do, we're going to play a game called Spot the Fake, okay? So you know this, that we are living in an age where computer-generated imaging and artificial intelligence is everywhere, right? Get talked about all the time, is this a real ad, or did a computer create this ad, or is this a real picture, or did it get photoshopped, all those kinds of things. So we are living in, some people call it the deep fake world, right, where we just never really know what's real unless you can kind of walk up and touch it, and even then sometimes you don't really know. But the 3D computer-generated images that are all over our world right now, they can be really, really hard for us to spot the fake. So let me ask, before we get started, how many of you think you're pretty good at spotting the fake when it comes to CG, computer-generated? Okay, 5 people. Great. You guys are all on my team. The rest of you, good luck. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you 5 different photos, so a series of photos, 5 total. In each of those photos, you will see everyday objects, 3 versions of an everyday object, right? Side by side by side. And every single one of those pictures, one of them is a fake. One is a computer-generated image. It's not a real one. The other 2 are actual, touchable, real objects, right, that were created. These are just everyday objects. We're trying to spot the fake. Now, 2 things. 1, no cheating. After all that judgment last week, I'm still recovering, so I just had to say that out loud. No cheating, and number 2, you can't change your answers at the end, okay, right? And don't lean over and check on, your partners or your spouses or your neighbors, okay? This is an individual effort, no, that's fine. It's an individual effort. Okay, you ready for number 1? You're going to spot the fake. Here's the first one. 1, 2, or 3. Which one do you think is the fake? 1, 2, or 3. I'll try to get out of the way. Can we see that okay from out here? It's not bad. Somebody want to hit the lights? Do you mind? Thanks, Wayne. All right. 1, 2, or 3. Write down your answer. Don't raise your hand. I'll go through all the questions first, and then we'll go back and see how you did. Okay? Does that sound good? Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate you. Everybody good with the first? Might need more time. All right, number 2. Here are 3 bananas. Which of these 3 bananas do you think is the fake? 1, 2, or 3? I can tell you that your entrance into heaven is not dependent on your answers here, okay? This is just for fun. 3 bananas, 1, 2, or 3. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, number 3. 3 different glasses. Which of these three glasses would you say is the fake? 1, 2, or 3? How many did I do so far? This is number 4, right? Okay, good. Is it? No, this is number 3. Okay, good talk. Everybody ready to go? Number 4, here we go. Here's a set of canisters. Which of these 3 canisters would you say is the fake? 1, 2, or 3? Based on your extensive knowledge of computer-generated imaging and 3D printing and all those things. Which one is the fake? Some of you are like, can we get this over with? Like, I have no idea. Last one, I think. Yes, number 5. The silverware. Which one of these 3, knife, fork, or spoon, is the fake? 1, 2, or 3, knife, fork, or spoon. Which one do you think is the fake? All right. Anybody need more time? How many of you think you got at least 2 right? At least 2? Maybe? Okay. How many say 3 or more? 4 or more? Okay, we got some people, maybe 4? Okay, how many of you think 5 for 5? You got this right. Okay, oh, sorry. Where's the 0, folks? Is there zeros in there? Yeah, this is great. I appreciate your humility today. You learned something after last week. Okay, so here's the answers, the spot the fake, the results. You ready? We're going to go one by one. First one is the apples. How many of you think it's number 1? How many think it's number 2? How many think it's number 3? 3's like, meh. All right, and the answer is number 1. Number 1 is the fake in the apples. Please don't cheat. Please don't change your answers. Do keep score, though. Okay. Number 2, we're going with the bananas. Here comes the bananas. How many say number 1? How many say number 2? How many say number 3? How many say got no clue? Okay, thank you. Yep. All right, the answer is ding, 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 ding. Number 3. 3 is the fake. That one got me, actually. I was wrong. The rest of these I got right. Just kidding. No. All right. We're on to the next one. This is the one with the glasses. This one I thought was pretty tough, actually. How many say number 1? Think it's 1? One person's like, yeah, probably. How many? 2? All right, and 3? Wow, okay. The answer is number 2 was the fake. 1 and 3, that one got you guys. That one got you good. Only a few people got 2. Is anybody 3 for 3 so far? Anybody? Oh, all right. Anybody else 3 for 3? Yes. This is great. Cool. All right. We're on to number 4. It's the canisters, I believe. 1, 2, or 3. 1, 2, 3. Oh, 3 again. Okay. It is number 2. Number 2 is a fake. What they did, this one was kind of cool. They took a picture of both and they mirrored the images and put them together. That's how they did that one. So, all right. And last one, I believe we are on the silverware. Yes, thank you for that reminder. Spoon. Spoon is number 3. Fork. Knife. That was pretty split. And the answer is the fork. The fork is you're 5 for 5? Oh, 1 for 5. Okay. Okay, who's anybody 5 for 5? We got a 5 for 5 in the room. Anybody? Don't be humble. There's money involved. No, I'm just kidding. 4 for 5? Anybody 4 out of 5? Really? Wow. Anybody else? 2? All right. You guys are on my team from now on. Like this, the big beard team. That's what we're doing. I said D, beard, not big beard team. Big beard, just so everybody knows. 4 for 5, 3 for 5? Okay, a smattering. 2 for 5? 1 for 5. Whoa. Okay, 0 for 5. Anybody 0-fers? Yes, I love you guys. You are awesome. You're my best friends. I live in a world that's like, yeah, that's real. Oh. Yeah, like I don't walk around wondering if it's a fake. Okay, so here's the summary of the answers just so you know. Apple was number 1, bananas number 2, cups number 3, canisters number 3, silverware number 3. Here's the deal. Okay? Sorry, canisters number 2. That's a deep fake right there. Yeah, there's the fork. There's the canister. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes I lie. Okay. So I'm just going to cover this one up. All right, let's see. Okay, keep going. Yeah, there we go. How does this... No, I'll just leave it back here so you know I'm human. We can have some lights back. Thank you, Wayne. Appreciate you. Here's your question, and it's the one that's burning in all of you. What in the world does this have to do with the book of Ruth? Okay. For those of you who've been worshiping with us the last 4 or 5 weeks, you'll know that we are in the Old Testament book of Ruth. And we're talking most about suffering. How do we respond to suffering? And here's my thesis for this morning, and stick with me, and you can tell me if I lied again. But here's the reality. Suffering makes us vulnerable to counterfeit forms of redemption. You see, when we're in the midst of suffering, it can be so difficult to identify the real Redeemer, can't it? Like when we're in pain, we grow weary, we grow confused, we get frustrated, hopeless even at times. And this pain, right, the pain of our suffering will cause us to overlook genuine redemption. And oftentimes we'll run after a fake one. You see that in your life? It's kind of like a person who's drowning, right? And you know the story. Drowning victims, most of the time, they don't care who's trying to come get them. All they want to do is get above the water. And they can easily drown the lifeguard in their disorientation, in their pain, in their fear. And the very thing the Redeemer sent to save them, they wind up at times even drowning. I was a lifeguard for like 8 years. And it was one of the first things we were taught, that if you're going to save anybody, jump in and save anybody in the water, first thing is you want to save them from the shore as best as you can. If you can't, then you have to get in. You wait till they stop struggling, because otherwise they will take you under. And so you stay far enough back while they're flailing and punching and kicking and doing everything they think they can. And it's just about the time their nose begins to dip under the water that's the time to come in and offer the redemption. See, that's the problem in the midst of our own pain. We will do almost anything to make that pain go away, including chasing after these counterfeit forms of redemption. A temporary solution to a long-term problem, a short-term gain that causes long-term pain. That is the reality. And so often, in the midst of suffering, we are very vulnerable to these counterfeit forms of redemption. Now, let me remind you that we're almost at the end of Ruth. We're in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. And here we're going to notice two different types of redeemers. It's a real redeemer and what I'll call a pseudo-redeemer, a fake redeemer. And when we last left Ruth, we're in this 4-act play, right? We've been talking about this for the last 4 or 5 weeks. We understood the crisis at the beginning, then there was this hope where she meets Boaz in the field, and then last week we ended on the complication. Remember that Ruth, she had met Boaz, and then she asked Boaz to be her redeemer. And there was a problem, right? Another family redeemer was closer to Ruth and their bloodline with Naomi. And when we left last week, Boaz had made that promise. He made a promise to Ruth. He put a deposit as a sign of his commitment to her and to Naomi, and he protected Ruth's dignity, and he protected Ruth's honor in that moment. But when we left last week, how did we leave Ruth? Waiting, right? Waiting. Kind of a cliffhanger at the end. Naomi's last words to Ruth at the end of chapter 3, wait, my daughter. Wait for the matter to settle. And I just feel like it's in the waiting that so often we're susceptible to these counterfeit forms of redemption. To these things that look good on the outside, but on the inside you realize that they're nothing more than computer-generated images. They're holographs, right? So as we go through, excuse me, the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, here's my recommendation for you. Would you pay attention to the two different types of redeemers and see if you can spot the fake? Two different types of redeemers in Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12, and see if you can spot the fake, and then why. What would cause you to say that that is the false redeemer? Ruth chapter 4, starting at verse 1. If you have your Bibles, you can follow along. I'll be in the book of Ruth 4, New International Version. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Okay, so again, a little bit of context. The end of Ruth chapter 3, Ruth had gone to the threshing floor. She had sat at Boaz's feet. She'd asked him to be her redeemer. Boaz was willing, but we had this complication, and he made this promise that he would not rest until the issue was resolved. The question of this alternate redeemer, this potentially even closer redeemer. So Boaz goes to the town gate. The reason why, notice this, okay? I've said this a few different times, and I want to make sure we don't miss the importance of these moments. But if you think about this story in Ruth, it happens approximately over at least a 15-year period, right? From the beginning where the famine was taking place and Elimelech decides to take his family until we get to the very end. It's about a 15-year period. And remember how long the book of Ruth is. It's only 4 chapters. So what the writer of Ruth is doing, the writer of Ruth is being so intentional to condense words and give you the most important facts. There's almost no fluff in the book of Ruth. And if you're one of those people who likes to kind of dig a little bit deeper into Scripture, I would challenge you, you could even do a word-by-word study of the book of Ruth because there's so much richness and depth. But the author of Ruth talks about Boaz going up to the town gate. The town gate was the place where business was taking place. It was like the public square because everybody had to come in and out of that one location. They didn't have a town hall at the time. They didn't have a courtroom. But this was the primary place. So he goes to the town gate, and I like this little phrase right here, just as the guardian redeemer. Notice that happens several different times throughout the book of Ruth. And in some of the translations it says, and it so happened, right? It so happened that the guardian redeemer came by. You see, the author in the book of Ruth is challenging us in the midst of our suffering to ask the question, does it really just happen? Or is there a grand designer behind it, right? Is there a narrative that's being written? So this is that same phrase, just as. It just so happened that the guardian redeemer that he had mentioned came along. And Boaz says, come over here, my friend, and sit down. Again, he's having a conversation with a fellow relative, and he's trying not to make it adversarial, but he does want to make it public. So he's at the town gate. He went over, and he sat down. Verse 2, Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, sit here. And they did so. What this is signifying is Boaz's, again, his integrity in trying to preserve the honor and the dignity of both Ruth and Naomi. He's saying, I'm not going to do this in a back room. I'm not doing a back alley deal. This is me publicly declaring my commitment to make sure that Naomi and Ruth are redeemed. So he takes 10 of the elders, he asks them to sit down. And when a person sits down in Scripture, it's actually, most of the time, in this setting, it's a seat of judgment, right? It's of saying, all right, you get to decide. The only person that gets to sit is the one that gets to decide. So they came and sat down. They did so. Verse 3, then he said to the guardian redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. Remember what he calls Naomi most often? Not Ruth the Moabite, but now she's saying coming back from Moab. The identity that's beginning to change here. So Naomi has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land belonged to our relative Elimelech. And I thought I should bring the matter to you, to your attention, and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. Okay, one thing you need to know about the Old Testament, land was life. Land equaled life. It was a way of saying, like, if you owned property, you had the ability to have life. So what he's asking this guardian redeemer to do is to literally not just redeem her property, but to redeem her life, and to do it in a very public way. Verse 5. Excuse me, this is 4 continued. If you will redeem it, then do so. This is Boaz speaking to the other kinsman redeemer. But if you will not tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except for you, and I am next in line. And this unnamed redeemer, we don't know the entire story. We don't know the person's name. But the unnamed redeemer says, I'll redeem it. Verse 5, then Boaz said to him, on the day that you buy the land from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. And this is kind of the turning point in the conversation. Verse 6, at this the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it. He knows that Boaz is willing. He says, you redeem it, for I cannot do it. Verse 7, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Dustin, can I borrow you for a minute? No, I'm just kidding. It's okay. Is this an awkward moment or what? Right? You're standing at the town gate. You've got the elders all seated in a position of authority. Boaz brings the potential kinsman redeemer, I'm trying not to lean too much, into the story, and then they start talking about this kind of awkward, somewhat weird tradition. We go into verse 8. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he took off his sandal. Now let me explain to you, taking off the sandal isn't like one of those flip-flops that people like to wear in the summertime, right? Sandals in that day, they were purposeful. They had straps that go all the way up the leg, and they were kind of work sandals, right? And depending on the type of sandal that you have, it might take you a while to get that off. So why? Why in the presence of the elders, why in the presence of all these people would this man wind up taking his sandal off? You do a little bit of history, and you find out that the sandal goes all the way back to that time when the people of Israel were about to enter into the promised land. And just before Moses passes away, he says, every piece of ground that your foot touches will become yours. Every piece of ground that your foot touches, that you take hold of, that you possess in this promised land will become yours. Remember, land equals life in the Old Testament. And so by taking off his shoe, he's saying, I'm giving up my right to walk this land. I'm giving up my right to claim this land for my family. And he hands Boaz his sandal, and he's saying, it is now your right. You buy it. I won't walk this land. I won't claim this land. Verse 8, the guardian redeemer says to Boaz, buy it yourself, and he removed his sandal. He literally hands the sandal over to Boaz. Verse 9, then Boaz announced to the elders and to all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I've also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are my witnesses. Again, this goes back to the time when the Israelites were being brought into the promised land, and they divided up the land by the 12 tribes of Israel, and then by the clans, and then by the families, right? Because land was life. The land represented the fulfillment of the promise of God, right? That physical dirt underneath their feet represented God's fulfillment of his promise of redemption. So it wasn't just a piece of property. It wasn't just something that they owned. It was a representation of redemption in that moment. That God had promised the people, his people, life. This is verse 10. I've acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. That's the whole point of the guardian redeemer, is to restore the land, restore the life of that family. And he says again, today you are my witnesses. Verse 11, when the elders and all the people at the gate said, we are your witnesses, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Anybody else famous from Bethlehem? Through the offspring that the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So let me ask, did you spot the fake? There were two types of redeemers in those 12 verses, right? It's not hard to see which one is the real redeemer. What's interesting, though, and I want to point this out to you, when the first redeemer, when the unnamed family redeemer, the one we don't know yet, when he hears about the land, what was his response, right? What was his initial response? Yes, please, thank you, and some more, right? You know what that's like in Potter County? I think when I first moved here about 4 years ago, land was going for about $3,000 to $4,000 an acre, and now it's going for like $10,000 an acre, right? I hear people say all the time, the only thing they're not making more of is land, right? So, the initial unnamed redeemer, oh, land, yep. Probably going to get it at a significant discount, understand, right? Naomi's kind of strapped for cash at the moment. And so his initial response, right? His initial thought was like, hey, I'll take that. I'm happy to regain that land. And most theologians, when you read this story, they'll say that he was basically he was doing his job, but he's really looking out for himself. He was looking out for his benefit, right? Because if you could expand your territory, then you're expanding your life. You're expanding your influence. You're expanding your authority. You're expanding your ability to provide for your family. And so at first, this unnamed redeemer had no question. Oh, yeah, I'll take care of that land. Until he realized what it would cost him. Until he realizes. So it's all the way back at verse 6. He says, the guardian redeemer said, I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. And you redeem it for yourself, for I cannot do it. Okay, perhaps he was worried about marrying a Moabite, which we know was the enemies of Jerusalem. When he found out that Ruth was part of the package deal, perhaps he was worried about marrying a Moabite. Perhaps he was actually more concerned about the fact that if Ruth had a son, do you know who becomes the rightful heir of that land that he spent all that money on? Ruth's son. And then it's basically the family of Naomi that is blessed, not his family. So in this story, we have two types of redeemers. And I need to remind us that when it comes to redemption, with this whole concept of buying back, restoring, taking what was broken and making it whole again, taking what was lost and making it found, right? The reminder is to redeem is to set free by paying a price. And for that first redeemer, the price was just too high. When he thought it was just a little bit of money and he was going to gain a whole bunch of land, right? It made sense. But when he finds out that he acquires Ruth as well and the responsibility of bringing a child into the world that would not actually be his own, but be considered the son of Kilian, and all the land would revert back to him when he becomes an adult, that was just too much. He was unwilling to pay the price. And here's the reality, genuine redemption. If it's real redemption, we're talking about this question as to whether or not we seek after real redemption in the midst of our suffering. Genuine redemption always requires a price to be paid. It always requires sacrifice. It always requires someone being willing to give up something that they dearly love in order to buy back that which does not even belong to them. Genuine redemption requires a price to be paid. And that was the problem with that initial redeemer, right? He was a false narrative. He was a computer-generated version of a redeemer. Because he was unwilling to pay the price necessary to buy back Naomi's story, to redeem Ruth's story. Tony Merida says it this way: a true redeemer is the kind of person who's willing to pay a price for the good of others. The first redeemer could only see the good for himself. The first redeemer could only see the good for his family. The first redeemer could only see how he would be benefited. But Boaz, the true redeemer, he demonstrates a level of commitment and character very much like who? Jesus himself. A willingness to surrender, to give something up, to pay a price for the good of someone else. Romans chapter 5 puts it this way. Paul says, you see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. And very rarely would anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us. His own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. 5 weeks ago, I said to you, Boaz is an archetype of the Messiah. He's a prototype. He's an advanced copy. And you see him over and over throughout the Old Testament. But Boaz showed us and shows the people of Israel what genuine redemption looks like, right? To prepare their hearts for the Redeemer. Someone who will be willing to sacrifice themselves on behalf of the other. And think about the sacrifice that Jesus did, right? Tozer says it this way: Jesus Christ surrendered himself in order that he might secure our redemption, right? Think about what it cost Jesus. Everything. His family, his relationships, his image, his standing in the world. It cost Jesus everything, up to his own life, to secure our redemption. He destroyed his enemies by dying for them. You ever thought about that? That the way that Jesus silenced his enemies was dying for them. The way that Jesus overcame his enemies was to demonstrate his love for them. And then he conquered death by allowing death to conquer him. That is redemption. That death could only be conquered through the Redeemer allowing that which could not conquer him to conquer him. Does that make any sense, right? The only way to silence his enemies was to die for them. This is the story of Jesus. And here's my challenge for you. I said this a couple weeks ago, but suffering is a real part of life. Either we have suffered, we are suffering, or we will suffer. But I challenge you to be very wary of any form of redemption that doesn't have a sacrifice attached to it. Be very cautious about chasing after a form of redemption that doesn't require sacrifice. When we're suffering and when we're in pain, when we're struggling, when our story doesn't make sense, when our marriage is on the rocks, when our financial picture looks really scary, when our kids are in the hospital, right? Like, you fill in the blank. You fill in your suffering story. In that moment, we are so susceptible to these false forms of redemption. We're so susceptible. We're so vulnerable. And we're going to encounter these numerous false forms of redemption. And they will only wind up costing us more in the end, right? They look really good on the outside, but when you go to pick up the apple and take a bite, it's not even there. When you go to pick up the banana and peel the skin off, it's hollow and empty. So what are those things for us? You ever wonder about that? What are those false forms of redemption in our day, a couple thousand years later? What are those things that when we're in suffering, we become really susceptible to? Usually they start with a 3-word phrase, okay? If I only. It's this mindset that we have. If I only. If I only made a little bit more money. If I only could work a little bit harder. If I only had a different spouse. If I only had more friends. If we just had a different president. If I only had a husband or a child or a bigger 401k or a truck that could pull more. If I only had a better job. You see, I believe that phrase, that if I only, that when it seeps into our brains in the midst of suffering, what it does, it just makes us so vulnerable to these false forms of redemption. And we go chasing after the bigger house or the better job or the different relationship, or we go chasing after all these things. And when we go to grab them, we just find that they're gone. They're just holograms. They're just computer-generated images, pixels that fall apart in our hand. But that doesn't make us any less susceptible. Usually, it starts with, if I only, and then it ends with, then I will, right? If I only, ... then I will be happy, fulfilled, restored, redeemed, right? Be careful, friends. Be careful with those if I only statements in the midst of your suffering. Because genuine redemption always requires a price to be paid. Genuine redemption always requires a price to be paid. The redemption of mankind, I mean, think about this. It cost Jesus everything. And why would we think it would cost us any less to follow him? When all of his disciples, 11 out of 12, died martyrs' deaths, and one stayed alive just to watch all his friends die. When the early church suffered over and over and over and over and over again under a regime that was trying to literally kill it all day, every day long. When people gave up family and friends and homes. When people sacrificed everything to follow Jesus, why do we think it would cost us anything less? We follow a suffering Savior. Our Redeemer paid the price for our redemption. So why would it cost us any less? Here's my question to you, and I'll leave us with this. Which type of Redeemer do you seek in the midst of your suffering? Which type of Redeemer do you wind up chasing after in the midst of your pain and your disorientation? What areas are you most susceptible to? What lies does the enemy throw at you? What if I onlys creep into your brain if you're not careful? See, in this story with Ruth and Boaz and this potential redeemer, right, we have a beautiful depiction of what genuine redemption looks like. A man who was not only able, but willing, sacrificially, voluntarily, to give himself to redeem someone else's story. And what if Ruth had chased after that other redeemer? What if he was better looking or had more money? What if he had a nicer personality? What if Ruth had given in to that temptation to chase after the alternate form, that false redemption? What story would be written with her life? What type of redeemer do you look for in the midst of your suffering? Where are your susceptible sources? My challenge to you this week, and it's in the study guide that's in the kiosk in the back, but I'm going to challenge you to create what I call a suffering response plan okay? This is your take it home moment, right? Because all of us, it doesn't take long, right? It doesn't take long for me to say, hey, there's genuine redemption sources and false redemption sources. Which ones are you chasing, right? You know what that looks like when we chase after these kind of computer-generated images of redemption. But what we don't often know what to do about that, right? We don't often know what to do in the midst of our suffering. We're so tired, we're so frustrated, we're so disoriented, we're so sad, we're so lost, we're so confused, we're so frustrated at God that we're so susceptible to these false forms of redemption. And what a suffering response plan does, it helps you to put together a step-by-step process for what you're going to do when suffering hits your life, because it either has, it is, or it will, right? And if you don't take the time to put together a suffering response plan before the suffering happens, you're just going to react. You're just going to be vulnerable. You're just going to chase after that which feels good in the moment, right? So knowing that we are prone to seek false redeemers in the midst of our pain, would you create a suffering response plan? Here's what I want you to do. Would you write down the steps that you will take when the bad news hits your life, when the phone call comes, when the text message shows up, when there's a letter on the table, when you get the news that life's going sideways? Write down the steps. The first thing you're going to do. What's the first step? It's up to you. I can't tell this for you. I don't know your response plan. There's not like a real right way of doing it. There's some wrong ways for sure. But when bad news hits your world, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to call somebody? Who are you going to call? What are you going to tell them? You're going to pray? Write down what you're going to pray. Put it into words. God, this is miserable, but I trust you, right? Something like that. And then what's your next step? What's your second step? Are you going to ask somebody else to pray with you? Right? Are you going to be open and honest about your own story? You're going to say, hey, like this really hurts right now. I'm tempted to just hide myself away and make it look like everything's fine, but it's really not. So would you enter into my pain with me? Is that your second step, maybe? And what's your third step? Maybe going to find a safe place to be with God. If you're a people person, maybe that's in the midst of a small group or a Bible study, or if you're an introvert like me, maybe there's a little spot on the top of the mountain where you just know that when the world's going sideways, you and Jesus have some space together. Write down the steps of your suffering response plan. Because if not, we're all susceptible to false forms of redemption. And if you're just coming out of suffering, okay, so put the story in your context. I don't know where you are in this journey of suffering. If you're just coming out of it, maybe go back and write down the things that you did well in the midst of that and the things that you wish you didn't do. That can be part of your suffering response plan. If you're in the middle of suffering right now, if this is you, if this is your story, if you're Ruth and you're waiting for the answer right now to your suffering, then my challenge to you would invite somebody in and ask them, someone who loves you and loves Jesus, and ask them to come and help you write your story, right? Write your plan. Because it's too confusing to do it alone. But if you're in between one of those right now and you know that suffering is a part of life, I challenge you. In the name of Jesus, to put together a suffering response plan that would include very specific steps when that disorientation comes, because all of us are susceptible to false forms of redemption. All of us are susceptible to false forms of redemption. And genuine redemption always requires a price to be paid.